My guests today are three friends I've known for 25, maybe 30 years. Tom Kim and Ron Mueller are partners at Gibson, Dunn here in Washington, D.C. They've both worked at the SEC. Bob Lamm is a partner at Gunster down in Florida. He's been in-house at 6 companies. We're going to talk about COVID disclosures. Ugh. Ugh. Not my favorite topic. I'm Brock Romanek. Today on Zippy Point. So the pandemic, it was a good year to not be working, not be in the trenches. I didn't have to follow closely what the SEC's guidance was, how companies have changed their practices. But now that I'm back, I want to learn something. So Tom, the first question for you is, how have earning practices changed during this difficult time?
Well, for the first time, we had all companies and all industries responding to the same macroeconomic trend, which was the COVID-19 pandemic and the remote workplace environment. And so what you saw by the second quarter of this year, one report estimated that 70% of the S&P 500 had either withdrawn their guidance or reduced their guidance. Another report I read calculated it differently. They said of the 285 companies that regularly give guidance in the S&P 500, over 180 of them had either withdrawn or reduced their guidance, which leaves 100 continuing to report. By the third quarter of this year, only 140 of those 285 companies, so 50%, had resumed giving guidance, which means obviously that the other 50% have stopped. I think in terms of the practice of giving guidance, as you know, every issuer disclaims the duty to update their guidance. And so, however, what happens is, to the extent that companies are projecting out and that it's just simply not within the realm of the likelihood that they will actually even meet the lower end of that range, a lot of companies felt a lot of pressure to update their guidance, even though they don't have a duty to do so. And of course, when it became obvious in certain industries that their business models were falling apart because, for example, they may be very consumer oriented, then I think there's considerable pressure by analysts, by the media, for companies to update their projections, even though they wouldn't otherwise have a duty to do so. I think what we're seeing now today is, people are responding to the industries they're in. And if in fact they do now have visibility, reasonable visibility into their future quarters, then if they're able to give guidance, they're trying to do so. After all, look at the stock market valuations. Those are based on what analysts think will be future performance by those companies. And of course, you do see some industries that have done very well, like the video game industry has done exceptionally well. And so there are pockets of of industries in which they have been relatively unaffected by the COVID or affected in positive ways. And then for others, depending on, again, what industries they're in, you see companies continuing not to give guidance because there's just so much uncertainty. And even today, as we filmed this on December 18, we've now had 2 vaccines approved, but of course, there's really no visibility for any of us. If you're not working in healthcare, we have no idea when we're going to get the vaccine and when we return to normal. So there's still, even 9 months after the shutdown took place, there's considerable uncertainty. And I think that's why we continue to see companies not resuming giving guidance.
I wonder if it'll be like some companies have done virtual annual meetings for the first time, and maybe they liked what happened with it, and that some companies might have reduced their frequency of their guidance or forsake it altogether and might continue that trend. Of course, it'll depend what industry they're in,
Right.
How much pressure they get from investors. But
right. And I think what has changed is, so instead of their giving guidance on revenue or net income or other GAAP measures, what we've seen a number of companies do is for them to give more operational data, key performance indicators, to help give or to provide more qualitative discussion about what they're seeing in their business, just to help investors in the market understand where the company is at that point in time. And so they're not projecting on financial metrics, but they're giving a lot of operational data to help give investors a clearer sense of how the company is being affected by COVID.
And Ryan, can you talk to some of these non-GAAP metrics?
Sure. I think there's been I think there was initially a lot of interest in saying, well, how can we present our financial results when there's so many unusual factors going on? And a number of companies, considered, well, should we back out this? Should we try to non-GAAP this? But I think what was interesting is early on the impact was so swift and pervasive that we were concerned as we were working with clients about, well, how are you really identifying that this is COVID related, and how discrete of an item is it? Could you, the big concern was, well, if you adjust for this item that's COVID related, what about everything else? Your revenues may have gone down, but your expenses may have gone down also, either because you were not paying for salespeople to travel or other types of expenses that got cut back. So I think initially, at least my experience was, we really did not see a lot of new non-GAAP disclosures, but instead, as Tom was mentioning, more of an effort to explain what was going into some of the numbers. I think as we're now getting a little bit more steady results and people are assessing kind of some of the longer term effects of COVID, we are starting to see some non-GAAP use, in particular with respect to, for example, impairments. Some investments are just not being utilized, or the valuations have changed so much. And as we get towards the end of the year, we're starting to see see some impairments. I think one thing that I was happy not to see was people trying to project what their business would have been absent COVID. I saw some early discussions about companies trying to say, well, our growth rate was at this rate prior to the last couple of weeks in March, but I think everyone quickly realized that there was just really no way to say what things could have been, and that continuing problems of trying to isolate of, well, what of this is COVID related? What of it may really be a permanent shift, as you and Tom were just talking about? Will work from home become much more prevalent? Will travel become, business travel become less common? So how much of those reductions in expenses are going to be permanent versus temporary?
And then, Bob, what about MD&A, the brand new MD&A, known trends and uncertainties, liquidity, result of operations, with such a dramatic change that only Bill Gates and a few others foresaw? The forward-looking disclosure that you sometimes get teased out of MD&A really became a factor, I think, right?
Yeah, I think it has become a factor. You probably know this, Brock, Tom, and perhaps Ron don't. I'm not a big fan of most companies' MD&As. They tend to leave the A out of it altogether and just restate their P&L or some other aspect of their financial statements without really adding anything appreciable to it. I'd like to think that some of the SEC's jawboning earlier in the year may have favorably impacted the quality of MD&A disclosure. I mean, there was that statement that Bill Hinman and Jay Clayton made, I think it was April 6th or April 8th, where they said historical financial information is relatively less significant, which struck me as the understatement of the year, at least in terms of the SEC nerdy world that we live in. I can't say that I've conducted a scientific sampling of companies' MD&As, but to the point that Ron made, I do think another statement that the SEC made about focusing on key performance indicators may have turned out to be as significant as the statement about historical financial information, because it gave companies something to ground their disclosures in. What do they look at? In terms of focusing on known trends and uncertainties, I think, it's really hard. Many companies, particularly at the outset of the pandemic, just said, there's a lot of stuff out there and we have no clue how it's going to work out. And as Ron and Tom have said, as we got further into the pandemic and companies sort of normalized what they were doing, not that this is in any way, shape, or form to be viewed as normal, they began, the good companies, the companies that really try seriously to engage in good disclosure, really tried hard to sort of settle down on what they thought the near term was like. But even now, and again, this goes back to what Tom said, we've got 2 vaccines, or at least one that's out there, one that's about to go out there. There's still an awful lot of uncertainty. So I think companies that are really trying to do a good job are keeping a very short time fuse on what they're saying, and still just saying there's a lot of stuff out there that we just can't know where it's all going to land.
I think what's interesting about that June statement, that April statement, Bob, that you referenced from Bill Hinman and Jay Clinton, is that statement was focusing on earnings releases and investor presentations. It was not about MD&A disclosure, which I thought was very interesting. In contrast, the Topic 9 and Topic 9A that was issued in March and June, I mean, both of those, for anybody preparing MD&A, you should read the questions that the staff post, because it's in a really nice way. They kind of broke down MD&A into a series of questions that, I mean, it was obviously about COVID, but you just put any trend or driver in there, and it's a very useful way to think about MD&A. And I do think that going forward, obviously those questions were not part of the new rule item 303 of MD&A, but in many ways I feel like they're as useful as anything I've seen the staff issue with respect to helping people analyze their financial results, getting back to your point, Bob, because I agree with you. I think companies don't do a very good job analyzing MD&A. And what's nice about the new item 303, which of course really does not take effect until the 2021 10Ks that get filed in 2022,
Right.
but read it anyway, because I think it does a nice job focusing on things like price, volume, shift of a mix of products, and so forth.
Yeah.
But I just thought that it was interesting that one key statement, which is a very unusual joint statement by these 2 leaders of the SEC, that it wasn't about MD&A.
Well, it wasn't, but I took it as a sort of shot across the bow, if you will. I totally agree that looking at the new rules, even though they're not effective, is a great idea. It never hurts to get ahead of the curve. I also think that, historically, I've always been surprised that the commission hasn't brought more enforcement actions for lousy MD&A disclosure. They did start out the year, I think it was in February, they went against Diageo for bad MD&A disclosure. There have been very few enforcement actions regarding MD&A. So again, another shot across the bow. So I hope that companies are paying more attention to the SEC's guidance, to the SEC's enforcement actions, and thinking about this stuff more carefully.
I think what was interesting was this was a year that, as you said, Bob, really companies kind of stepped back and many of them, because of the uncertainty of what was going on, instead of trying to kind of rewrite or integrate everything into their MD&A, many of my clients kind of began their MD&As in the quarters with a COVID overview. And it was very important at this time because not only had things changed so quickly, but it was also difficult getting news out. I mean, there were not analyst conferences going on. Those were, all being canceled. And people had, questions that you don't usually ask, which are, along the lines of, well, how many of your plants are actually operating? How many of them have been shut down? And so really those key performance indicators and that kind of overview of just how is the business doing became front and center. And I think it'll be interesting as we go into the 10K MD&A and companies are thinking about, well, how do we, frame this again for the year in which we're not sure what will happen. Things may be good, things may be bad, but I think that it's a time to kind of continue that good practice of the overview and say, let's talk about, what's going on in the business and what are some of the factors that are key influencers of how our business is going to operate this coming year, given where we stand today.
Yeah, and I think that some companies, again, I don't think you can make a generalization about how different companies handle it. For example, I spend most of my time now in the small cap world, and there's a huge gulf between what you see the large cap companies and the small cap companies doing. But I do think that companies, to a degree at least, have become more comfortable saying, we just don't know. Of course, that presumes that they really don't know and that they're not hiding anything. But if you don't know, it's okay to say we don't know. We just have no idea where this thing is going to go.
Then, Tom, if you're saying I don't know, how do you tie that into risk factors that are COVID influenced, updating those probably?
It's interesting. When you look at the 2019 10Ks, they were all due at the very end of February, actually March 2nd, because of the 60 days fell. And so obviously in early March, March 2nd, the pandemic fully hadn't hit. We were about a week and a half away. And so, but we did see a number of public companies in their 10Ks, if they were calendar year filers, they did have a risk factor about COVID because it was obviously it had already surfaced in China. Maybe we saw it in Washington State. Of course, when the first quarter Qs and second quarter Q came about, many companies did, of course, address the COVID. And I think they had to be careful in terms of talking about what they were actually experiencing and how they were characterizing the risk presented by COVID. And if it was if the risk had actually materialized, then you need to talk about it really more in MD&A than in risk factors. But I do think that companies have done a good job, relatively speaking, in updating their COVID-19 risk factors as the quarters have progressed. I think what's interesting for the 10K that's coming up is now we have new item 105. And new item 105 about risk factors does say, look, if you have a generic risk that's applicable to all companies, then you need to file it under the new category, general risk factor. And of course, COVID-19 is a risk that we are all facing, but of course, but not in the same way. And that's why I don't think it is a general risk factor. I think a risk factor is general and needs to be categorized as such only if not only does everybody experiencing it, but they're experiencing it in more or less the same way. Here, I think companies are very much depending on their industry, their workforce, how they've chosen to establish production, whether it's, do they rely on a Chinese or a workforce in China or India, or have they set up their facilities here? I think they're so differently situated that I don't view the COVID-19 risk factor as being general. And I think the challenge is going to be, are there still risks that have yet to materialize, or do you need to do a better job in MD&A in terms of better explaining how COVID-19 has been impacted or has impacted the results of the year? And so by this point, investors don't need companies to point out COVID-19 as a risk. I mean, that's obvious. So I think it's less, in my view, about risk factors and more about either identifying ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic may, in the future, impact your business. But I think more it's about doing a better job analyzing the various ways in which your business, in terms whether it's top line, whether it's revenue or whether it's liquidity, how it actually has impacted 2020 results. And of course, there's another aspect to it, which is there are the new requirements of having to do a summary if you're longer than 15 pages, and then having to categorize or group them by category. I don't think you need, the SEC did not adopt the prominence requirement, but I think many companies choose to lead with their most important and most significant risks before others.
I was just going to chime in, Tom, and say I totally agree with you, because if you put it under general, it suggests that one size fits all. And honestly, one of our clients has two different aspects of the same industry in its marketing arena, and each of those operations, each of those business, they're not separate business segments, but each of them has experienced a totally different set of factors that have influenced revenue. So even there, the risk factors that they face are sort of inconsistent within their own business. Another practice point that I found really useful this year was when you look at subsequent drafts of the filing, and I was thinking about it when you were talking, one of our clients filed its 10K much earlier than it was supposed to, which I think was fine. I should say much earlier than it had to. But even in the 2 or 3 week period that we were reviewing successive drafts, the COVID situation began to change because it was late February, early March. And we were we looked back at the first draft after we filed, and not only did the COVID thing keep going up in terms of priority and prominence, but the nature of the disclosure really changed. And I think that's probably going to be true in early 2021 as well. It's a very quickly moving target.
That's a very good point. Obviously, the filing speaks only as of its filing date, but we can, I think, see a lot of things developing week by week.
Yeah.
As hopefully, when the new administration comes in, hopefully there's a new, clearer plan for vaccination so that we all understand where we stand in the line, so to speak, and can plan our lives, sort of pre-post vaccine.
And then Ron, what about the impact of government assistance? We got another bill about to probably get passed. And so there's continues to be developments in this area.
And I think the story there is pretty simple. That is, out of, if it was material to understanding your operations, you need to disclose it. A lot of it, some of the obvious impacts of PPP loans. I think some companies that took those were of the view they were not material to their operations, but given the amounts, but some of them were, and it was important to disclose those. Going forward, the big impact is on taxes and tax rates and tax loss carry forwards and stuff like that. And again, I think it's just important to kind of isolate those effects and call them out so that people understand where this is coming from. Sometimes it's leading to some earnings surprises, and it's important that people understand how that came about.
And then Bob, we were talking about fast moving developments just a second ago. What about the use of voluntary case to keep the market informed?
Well, all generalizations are false, including the one I'm about to make. But I think that in general, the more disclosure you can get out there in uncertain times, the better off you are. But again, there's a caveat there that you've got to speak the truth as best you know it. I'm familiar with the filings of one company in the restaurant industry that, in my view, did a terrific job. I wish it were my client, but it wasn't. Did a really terrific job of keeping its investors informed all along the way. They filed, I don't know exactly how many 8Ks, I don't recall, but they filed a lot more 8Ks during the period leading up to their 10K. I think their fiscal year ends in May, than they would normally do in any period. And I understand there was some management pushback on that, but at the end of the day, keeping their investors informed really did them a great service when they came up to their proxy and they had a say on pay challenge, which they did very well at. There's also, I think, a larger lesson to be learned here, whether it's the 8K or any other filing you're making, which is that if you only disclose exactly what the rules require and no more, again, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. It doesn't mean you can say anything you darn please, but focusing on what's really important to your investors and going beyond the bare minimum that's required, I think can be really helpful. Companies have been doing that in their proxy statements for a long time, and I think the same is true as we get into the 10Ks and 10Qs. I think this year, I should say next year, it's almost next year, as companies think about their 10Ks, there's a lot more principles-based disclosure requirements than we've seen in the past. This is certainly a hallmark of the Clayton regime at the SEC. But the same kind of principles-based mindset, I think, needs to be applied when you're talking about even existing rules that are still rules-based. I mean, I've spoken to some people at the staff about this, and I think principles-based disclosure is great, but it's a challenge for those of us who've been dealing in a rules-based environment, because the client will say, well, show me where it says I have to say that, and of course you can't point to it. But I think the leaders in the field will hopefully get their companies across that bridge. Having made the generalization that I just made, we were talking before we started taping about the Cheesecake Factory enforcement action, which I will mention by name because it's out there. Tom may have some comments on this, but that was an instance where I think more disclosure was not better, but in my view at least, the company was just being too cute. Saying that their operations were continuing sustainably or in a sustainable manner when you have only 16 weeks of enough cash left in your till to keep going for 16 weeks just sort of clashes with reality. So it goes back to the basics. Be careful what you say, even though I still think that companies should go beyond what the minimum requirements are. Tom, you had some comments on that. Maybe you want
No,
to jump in.
I agree with what you said. I just wanted to point out that the Cheesecake Factory, the disclosures at issue were actually in furnished 8Ks. One under 701, the FD 8K, and then the second statement that they made in the second press release, because it had to do with a completed fiscal quarter, they had to furnish it under 202. But in each case, these are voluntary statements that, because they're made in an 8K, even though furnished, did subject to potential 13A liability, and that was the charge. So it's just, there really is no free pass. Once you choose to open your mouth, even in a furnished 8K, you just have to be very careful about what you say. And I agree, Bob. I think there it was an example of a company being a little too cute about the word sustainably and not really clarifying what they meant by that. And of course, it was not intended to be a synonym for liquidity, because they're experiencing significant liquidity issues that quickly became public. And obviously it would have been widely apparent, because obviously it's a restaurant that serves customers. So when those restaurants are closed, even if they have a takeout business, it's no shock to anybody that they were experiencing cash issues. And those would have been widely apparent to anybody who tried to go to a Cheesecake Factory restaurant. So.
And then Tom, what about this fast-paced moving environment, and as well as the notion that everyone's working from home now? How does that impact internal and disclosure controls?
Surprisingly, it seems not to have impacted them very much. I don't think you saw many companies taking advantage of the filing relief that the staff was offering for this first and second quarter 10Qs. And I do think that I'm not aware of companies missing proxy statement deadlines. And so, thankfully, if that's the right word, the COVID-19 pandemic happened in 2020 as opposed to 2017. I think we've gotten that much better in terms of being able to communicate and see each other on Zooms and conference calls and so forth, such that people were able to shift to a remote work environment, and people were able to have reasonable assurance that they were in fact capturing all the information they needed to capture for purposes of disclosure controls, and that the accounting controls, which were already, they were very IT reliant anyway, that people were comfortable with the level of assurance given by their internal controls. I'm not sure how this will translate in terms of year-end 404 internal control over financial reporting, those attestations and those evaluations of the effectiveness of those controls. Maybe that's sort of one question mark I have going into the end of the year, and of course thinking about 10K reporting. But otherwise, I think it's been surprising to me and to a lot of people that public companies have by and large been able to maintain timely reporting, notwithstanding the fact that everybody is working from home. Ron?
No, I totally agree with you. And, it's hard to say that anything about COVID-19 was fortuitous, but I think the timing was fortuitous. And it's also fortuitous with respect to the coming crop of 10Ks. Some of you may realize that I also do some work for the Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness. And one of the things that we've talked about internally and to some degree externally is doing the audit remotely. Obviously, despite the advanced technology that we've all benefited from, the concept of, never standing there sort of checking the ledgers as you sit at the table is a little bit challenging for auditors. But again, they've had a lot of time to prepare for that. So from what I gather, the audit process is going quite smoothly at most companies, at least, and nobody expects any big shocks from completing the audit in a timely manner.
And Ron, what about reminding insiders, directors, and executive officers about their obligations regarding insider trading, 10b5-1 plans, and Section 16 issues? Is that, we have market volatility, we had the market plunge and then rebound so quickly. And there always, whenever that happens, we've been around long enough to know that there always ends up being a couple of people that get snared either from some fortuitous trading, or maybe it really was fortuitous trading without the question marks. How do you better protect those insiders in the company during this kind of period?
Yeah, it's a really difficult time, and particularly now as we're going into year end, many insiders have stayed out of the marketplace for much of the year. There is, the markets are booming, nevertheless, for many companies, and I think there's a lot of pressure on that, and it's really important to to do a careful assessment of what internally versus what is known externally. I think the opening point to remind insiders is that, because I'm hearing many people say, well, we don't know anything more than the marketplace. But if you're being investigated, that's being done in hindsight. It's the same thing as with the Cheesecake Factory case, where they're going to be looking back in hindsight at not what was said, but what did you know and what happened. And given that the market has been volatile but strong, it could also be volatile and down. And so I think insiders really need to think about well, what happens if this is an turbulent marketplace, and in a month from now, the stock prices are coming back down to reality, and and my trades are being looked at. What did we know? Did we have information on trends that were not evident to the marketplace? What is our market? What is driving the effect on our stock price? And in many cases, not every case, but many cases, I think people will say, maybe it's still a little of a turbulent time, and particularly now, right before announcing earnings. But as we get into January and February, I think it's going to be particularly tricky for companies, for insiders to be trading, and companies will probably be, it will really depend on what they say, and whether they're able to give guidance again when they announce year-end results. Thinking about what disclosures do they have coming up, when will they be making disclosures, what will they be saying, and really saying, in light of thinking ahead like that, are we comfortable trading?
To me, I think the risk of being second guessed on a materiality issue is high when it comes to insiders appearing to take advantage of their insider status. Even if they didn't have MMPI, they can never say that they don't know more than the market knows. They're managing the company. They have so much data that even if in and of itself each piece is not material, they have a picture of performance that the market simply does not have. And so I would just reinforce, Ron, what you said about insiders being very careful about their purchases or sales during this period, because certainly with Cheesecake Factory, they charged the company with having made material misstatements. I would be concerned about the risk of being second guessed in this environment. And of course, we will have a new SEC led by a new director of enforcement next year. And so it's, we don't really know yet their enforcement agenda, but you can be sure, as always, that insider trading will be high on that list, as it always is.
Yeah, and there are a couple of other factors that I would urge people to think about. We all scratched our heads over the Endeavor enforcement action, where the commission went after a company not for what we would have thought was sort of traditional insider trading, but failure of internal accounting controls to go after a company that had bought its own stock at an inopportune time. In retrospect, when I saw the case, I really scratched my head and said, why did they do this? But the more I thought about it, it seemed pretty clear that it was difficult to prove cyanar, which you have to do as a component of an insider trading action, when the company had actually asked, is it now okay for us to do this? I don't know whether that case has any precedential value, but I wouldn't want to take a chance if I were advising a client, oh, that's not going to happen to you, because I think if they can't get you on insider trading because of a lack of cyanar, they're going to try some other route. And I think particularly given going back to the statements that Clayton and Hinman made early in the year, they warned companies that this was a dangerous time. for insider trading abuse. So companies ought to proceed at their peril. The other thing, and this came up recently, I was asked about the case of Albert Bourla, who's the Pfizer CEO, who traded at an inopportune time. Obviously, I left Pfizer, 8 years ago, so I have no knowledge of anything there really, other than what I read in the papers. It's pretty clear that he's not going to be prosecuted because his transaction was effected under a 10b5-1 plan. But it does speak to the fact that, in my view, companies should do a much better job educating their investors and the public about what a 10b5 plan really is. No matter, yeah, I know it's in the footnote on the Form 4 filing, and maybe it's mentioned someplace else, but most people just do not understand what a 10b5 plan is. And I think if companies did a somewhat better job of talking about their insiders' 10b5 plans and explaining what it really is, it wouldn't have quite the same optics effect that, for example, his transaction had.
That's the classic case of somebody saying, look, I put the 10b5-1 plan in place many months ago. I don't know his facts, but I have addressed oftentimes the issue, well, the optics of the transaction happening now are bad. Should we just cancel the trade? And that might have been a situation, and of course, canceling a trade is neither purchase nor sale, so it is not itself a 10b5-1 event.
Right.
But I wonder the extent to which, would they have been better served in terms of having, not having this be an issue of just canceling that trade in view of everything else going on at the company and with respect to the status of the vaccines development and testing.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on the Endeavor case, the one thing I think it is helpful for is pointing to insiders and saying, look at how you get second guessed in hindsight.
Yeah.
And because if you lay out the facts there, CEO had been in merger negotiations previously, they had fallen apart, they had been silent for some time, and was about to go and have a meeting with the CEO of the other company to see if they reopen. I think many people would say at that time, not probable, even if the magnitude was that great. It had fallen apart before. In fact, it took, I think it was 6 weeks before a deal was done after that time. And yet, this commission didn't hesitate to look at it in hindsight and say, well, something was wrong here. And so it's really not the actual charges that got brought as much as just, they'll find something, or you will settle for something, to get rid of that investigation.
Yeah, well, I'm not speaking critically of the commission at all, but insider trading charge, no matter how it's brought, whether it's internal controls problem or classic insider trading charges, always do well for the commission politically, generally and with specific reference to Congress. So it's not surprising that they would go after this. And, we lawyers love to have cautionary tales, excuse me, so we can shake our fingers to our clients and say, don't go there.
Yeah, clearly the staff did not like what happened. And this shows their willingness to take an action on whatever legal basis they can find. And of course, that was a Republican SEC.
Exactly.
You can only imagine more of the same, if not greater, than in a Biden SEC. And that, I think, is certainly a takeaway for everybody going into this next earnings season.
And it's a reputational issue as well, of course, as part of this, because the media is heavily interested in this. So even if the SEC is not interested, the media might write an article. It'll mention 10b5-1 plans, but of course.
Yeah. Well, in fact, to Tom's point, when Albert Bourla was, excuse me, asked by the media, he said, gee, on balance, I wish I hadn't gotten in the paper for this.
Right.
So I think, despite the fact that he didn't do anything wrong, I think it was still embarrassing.
The final takeaway may be, think about this now, start drafting your 10b5-1 plan, think about what you're going to announce at earnings, and sign that plan the day after you announce earnings.
Well, thank you
so much. And then have a cooling off period after that.
Right.
So I hope this doesn't have to be an annual program. This there's a one or two off. And can't wait to see you guys in person. Thanks very much.
Likewise.
Have a good day.
Likewise. Thank you, Brock.
Yep. Thanks, Brock. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tom.